I'll ask everybody, we'll go quiet here and we will begin 25 hours of the day of the Swan. I know most days are 24 hours, but this one happens to have an extra session, which we've put on right at the front. This is our, I guess, pre-teaser, if we will, and it's going to be a great one. We have Cindy and Catherine here from the UK, and they are going to be going through a global perspectives workshop and really bringing sense making to the fold, both on a local and global level. I thought I would spend, my name's Sean Moffat. First of all, I'm one of the key organizers of today. I thought I would spend just 2 minutes up front, just mentioning what we're going to go through today. I want to thank the organizing team. There's been about 6 or 7 of us that have done real yeoman's work in 4 weeks ago, deciding, you know what, we should celebrate the 1-year anniversary of our Grey Swan Guild. There's a turning of the page in society as we all get vaccinated. There's also a turning of the page in the guild, and we thought this was an important touchstone to use as a way to actually expose some of the best minds in the guild and create a forum for discussion, for sense making, for participation, and that's what the next 25 hours is going to be. We've just had our 1,000th member join, and so part of today's discussion also is, if you like what we do, hopefully you'll end up joining the guild. We're global, we're diverse, we're very inclusive, and so with that kind of spirit, we're entering into today's sessions. And I know a lot of these sessions are interactive as well, so we'll not only hear the voice of our key leaders, but we'll also hear our members as well. So really, without further ado, I'll just say that all of our sessions, some of them are going to be fun, some eclectic, some serious, some very expert in terms of their orientation, but their end design is to make sense of the world. That's what we're trying to do. You can see the entire event schedule at greyswanguild.org/Day of the Swan. And with no further ado, I'll introduce Cindy and Cate Russell. You guys can tell me who will be taking the lead on this. You're going to be talking about sense making, medical professionals located out of the UK. And I'm very excited to find out how you're using sense making to actually surface perspectives in terms of determining actions and policies and decision making, you know, a whackload of other things. So I will bridge it over to you.
Thanks so much, Sean. Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy Russell. I'm actually located in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And Cate Russell, no relation, is located in Aberdeen, Scotland. So we're really excited to be here today and absolutely want to first just thank our sponsors, the Grey Swan Guild. Wonderful. We just learned about you and it was awesome to discover you, and I'm very excited about the next 25 hours and so happy to be here today. So just wanted to highlight a couple things for you just in terms of what today could look like. Cate and I wanted to keep this pretty informal, and we have I'll flip over slides here so you know who we are. Cate is actually a medical professional in, as I said, Aberdeen, Scotland. She's our founder for this project. My role is I operate a business called Consider Conversation, Global Insight Strategies Connections, and we are volunteering to support the project in whatever way we can. The project was developed in collaboration with the Cynefin Centre, and it has evolved since its beginning. And what I'm going to do is hand it over to Cate, and I'm going to stop sharing so you can see her. And that way she can tell you a little bit about the project and where things are at. Followed after Cate is just a quick snapshot of some of our results from our Sensemaker project. And then we're going to head into some discussions. So that's what the next hour will look like. So I'll stop sharing and over to you, Cate.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cindy. That's a really nice introduction. So hi, everyone. My name's Cate and I'm currently in Elgin, which is just an hour and a half from Aberdeen because I just moved back here this week. So sharing global perspectives. It's a beautiful project and something which I think everyone who's come on board feels very passionate about. So we officially launched in January this year, which was a little bit later than we would have wanted. But our essential goal when we started out was to highlight perspectives of 2020. And I think everyone who's here will agree that we've all been through very different and diverse lived experiences over the year of 2020. And so the project set out to try and highlight that, and in doing so, highlight our diversity. So as Cindy said, we've been working with the Cynefin Centre, and they have very kindly supported us with Sensemaker. And the main, I don't know if anyone has heard of Sensemaker or if you've not heard of Sensemaker, but we can sort of ask questions about that later if you haven't. And so we essentially designed the software to look at main things of values, attitudes, perspectives, and essentially ask very broadly, you know, what have you experienced and can you share that with us? And so we've started since January, and since then some amazing local leads and a great team around the world have come on board to work with us at engaging people locally. And that really is kind of the primary model that we've worked with, which is actual local engagement and people getting stories from their communities and then being able to actually share the results and engage communities with those results locally. Thank you, Rob. So I think what we're going to do today is just go through some of the results. We've been with April now, so it's been 4 months. And we're going through a bit of a transition phase because we realize there's actually much more power to what we're doing, and also 2020 is moving on a little bit now, and there's a lot more happening which we also need to be working with. But what we'll go through today is just some of the data from what's been shared so far for 2020 specifically. So back over to you, Cindy.
Can you see the screen okay? Perfect, thank you. All right, so I am going to see if we can get a document put in the chat here as well. But just going back to what Cate said, this is what our website currently looks like. You can see that we're out to actually better understand and change the world. So like any Sensemaker project, you want to understand the environment before you act in it. And so this is our objective in collecting some of this data. This is, you can see here that this, I'm not sure, is there anybody who's not familiar with Sensemaker? Can I just see if there's anybody, everybody's good with using the tool Sensemaker? Okay. So this is our data so far. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to digest this. What's really interesting about Sensemaker is that you can filter the data in so many different ways. This is just a regular snapshot that allows you to kind of see just general patterns that are currently happening in the environment. One of the things that I will caution you of is to not walk away thinking that these are the patterns, because with any Sensemaker or sense-making project, it's really a collective experience, and people need to actually be together talking about their context and coming to conclusions together. So while everybody's perspective is appreciated when you're looking at these patterns, Sensemaker is about that collective perspective. So I'll just emphasize that up front. I'm not sure, Cate, if you want to just talk about any of these in particular, or just give some people some time to look them over.
I think some time to look over probably is sensible, but just for anyone who isn't potentially aware of what this data means, every dot is essentially, so as I said, with the collector sites, we had a prompt and a very broad question. And then everyone who's entering into the collector site comes and they're able to self-interpret their story. So every triangle or triad that you see here, it's sort of what you see on the top, which is the description and the experience I shared, responsibility came from ... And then people self-interpret where they feel their story fits or where their experience fits, and sort of puts the marker in relation to the different areas in the triangle. So every dot represents how someone has self-interpreted their story.
Perfect, thanks. I am just going to see if I can, I'll have to stop sharing and get the document into the chat, but I'll do that in a few minutes. I'm going to just move on to the next slide, which actually shows you the same picture, but it shows you what else Sensemaker can do too. So it gives you a better sense in terms of percentages of how many people responded in each area of the triangle. And we're very curious to get all of you to look at this from your own context. So thinking about your own communities or your workplace or an organization that you maybe volunteer at, just to get, or even personally, just to get a better sense of what this means to you and what you think some conversations could result in. So if you were to bring people together and you were to show them this, what patterns do you think would stand out for people? Does anyone have any comments or questions or so far about this? Any insights that are surprising anyone?
I guess one question would be, what was your level of learning curve in terms of when you started to where you finished, and how many kind of ahas did you have along the way? And I'll presume you're masters of the tool now, but how long might it have taken you to go from neophyte to master?
I'm very happy to answer this because I am a complete novice with Sensemaker, and I'm still learning as I go because there's just so much. There's so much to using Sensemaker and sensemaking and complexity, which I was completely introduced to a year ago now. The actual conceptualization and kind of thinking, what questions do we want to be asking? That was a period where I worked with Anna, who also works within Cynefin, and was able to support us in actually getting this together. But I'd say the best way to actually figure out Sensemaker and to actually work with this is to get stuck in, because there's just so much that emerges as you go along. And that's one of the reasons that we're going through a big restructuring at the moment, is because we've actually realized that there's so much in the engagement process and in the sense making with the data and with communities that can actually drive so much more power locally, and then to bring that more internationally in more of a global sense making as well.
Thank you so much.
And I've just changed slides so that you can see that there's another way of looking at the data as well. So these are dyads. And these are looking at more of the extreme areas that people are experiencing.
I'm quite tempted to start talking about some of them, but I don't want to. I don't want to then bias people's own thoughts. So I think if everyone is just happy to gather their own thoughts from this, that's more important.
We were going to look at going into smaller groups, but I think that we're actually a pretty decent size here. So just curious, is there anything that is standing out for anyone? Something that's maybe creating a question in your mind about, I wonder why they said that, or why the dots are there, or this is kind of surprising, it's not what I expected. Is anybody seeing any of that?
Well, one of the things that I was curious about is the dyad that you're talking about in the top right-hand corner, the sort of drastic and irreversible and of no consequence. Do you have, since I've looked at Sensemaker data that's been taken over this last year, have, I guess, the flip side of that, because some of it went from what you could claim was a bit either way to quite positive, and you could see the transition once you look sort of further and further and further up from an overview point of view. You've got that strong feeling that not all of this is negative, and so we've got drastic and irreversible. Where was the positive sentiment shown in your data?
Cate, I'm going to leave that to you because you've been into this data more than I have. So
I'm just looking at the actual analysis that I did
You,
'Cause what-
do you want to actually put that up would that make more sense?
No.
All right.
No, I think it's more important to go through the actual sense making before we actually look at the breakdown.
So one of the things that you've raised, and I'm sorry I couldn't see on my screen who said that because I'm in presentation mode here. So it was a really interesting insight because it's something that we saw as well. And we basically went, there's a contrast there. So what does that mean? And one of the things that has evolved with this project is the way in which where our focus has gone. So initially, when I joined this project, and I'll only speak from my perspective, Cate, when I joined this project, it was all about collecting those stories about 2020. It was all about Sensemaker. It was all about, you know, getting that into the tool. And what has transpired since then is that there have been so many people who have become interested in why we're doing this, and that we're interested in gathering global perspectives, that the project is evolving and is growing. And what's becoming more apparent all the time is that this data is wonderful, but what really is the important piece here are the conversations that we have because of the data. So the insights that can come from bringing the group of people together, looking at this together, and in the same context going, okay, what does this mean? What do we need to look at? Where do we think the story should be in these triads? And where do we, if we think the story should be indexed in such a way that, as an example in number one, that, you know, all focused around policies and processes, and it's not, then what does that mean for us? So it's all those questions and all the insights that come actually from going, this is really interesting. What do we do with this? The project, I would say, has evolved even further in the sense that we actually are moving away from it being all about 2020 and being more about let's collect those perspectives from around the world and what matters to people everywhere. And so we're in this bit of a transition stage right now. Cate, I hope that was okay to share.
Absolutely.
But it's pretty exciting. It's pretty exciting. But I'll bring you back to the triads again. So recognizing that, you know, everybody's ahas are going to be different. We'd like to know, like, is there anything else here that is surprising anyone? Because there is the opportunity for us to kind of grab on and look at what stories are in what area. We can't do that, of course, in this kind of format. It makes it a little trickier. But we are capturing what people are saying as we do these sessions, just to say, okay, this stood out for someone, this stood out for someone, this stood out for someone. Okay, wonder why, let's look at this and let's pay attention. It might be a weak signal, right? So it's, yeah, so I'll let all you folks chime in now.
This is Rob. I'm looking at number 6. The perspective and the experience I shared was global versus local versus national, and doesn't surprise me that 40% is global, but the difference between global and local being so far apart is surprising to me. From 40% to 14%.
That was a surprise for me as well, Rob. Yeah, especially when people are telling very personal stories. Yeah.
And I'll just mention to everybody that's joined us, if certainly feel comfortable to unmute yourself and verbally ask a question. You can also ask it in chat for the Russells. I guess as we wait for maybe some other questions, I'm wondering, it's such a visually interesting and compelling tool. I'm wondering if there's any experiences of things that you surfaced that you might not have ordinarily surfaced if it was just emails and stuff flying back and forth, but because they were visualized, they became much more apparent for you. Sorry, I should ask easier questions. I am
That's a good
your
question.
I am your MC after all. I should give you the lightweight questions.
Really sorry, Sean, what was your question? I was focusing on trying to bring something up.
Yeah, no worries. Doing the juggle act. I just it dawns on me that it's such a visually interesting tool in terms of what you were able to apply it against. Were there insights or kind of different narratives that came out of the exercise because it was so visually brought to the forefront, as opposed to if it was just a set of, you know, long essays or whatever? Is there any experiences in terms of the visualization component?
Visualization, are you referring to the actual patterns?
The patterns, I think we saw in the previous one, there was a bit of a relief map, I guess, if you want to call it. But it just seems to be that sometimes the headline screams from the visual versus, you know, something that might be buried as the lead and just a free-form essay.
Yeah. I'm I'm struggling to see the relation between this and a free-form essay, because they're just so
so different.
Powerful.
I would be helpful a little bit there on that one. The visual format really serves when you can see the gaps between the dots. When you have, as I've dealt with data sets at 2,500 stories, the biggest one that I've actually touched and had my hands on is 12,000. So someone described it as a Christmas tree. I've heard other descriptions. So it serves and it doesn't. It depends on how many stories you've got. And it depends, I think, on how much you're willing to filter them to keep the space that you can see. But it certainly gives people starting points that they would never get from just text that's not signifying. So you didn't hear that, but that's okay.
So what's very interesting with what you can do when you're actually looking at these results, and obviously this is a global, you know, input we got because of the kind of chronological order of how local leads came on board, and then because of some actual glitches in the save button. A lot of the dominant stories are from Canada and then from different places in Europe, or North America and Europe by region. But when you're actually looking at this data, the way that you can filter the stories is really important as well. And Sensemaker was originally developed for counterterrorism so that you could pick up weak signals. And for example, here, if you look at kind of the outliers or the areas where you potentially have less density of where the pattern is, for example, if you look at Triad 1, where responsibility came from. And I think this, in terms of my own personal looking at it, in a world where you've essentially had lockdown, or for us in the UK, you've had lockdown and policies that have been determining behaviour and responsibility and, you know, imposing different structures on society, to have so few answers in policies and processes, to me, that stood out as something that's very interesting. And you can essentially filter down into those stories to see kind of, you know, why is that? Are they more positive stories? Are they more negative stories? Why is it that responsibility did come from those policies, and does that mean something? And that's the type of thing that you can actually be doing with this data. And that's, so you've got, you've got so much more that you can do through looking at these different stories, looking at the narratives, but you don't actually start when you look at this data. And I think anyone who's worked with Sensemaker will, you know, be able to explain that you're not actually supposed to look at the stories and the individual narrative. You look at the patterns and you kind of look at, you can think, okay, there's a density there, there's less density there, and then depending on sort of what your initial impression is, or what your questions are, or what the questions are that come from the group who this actually relates to, then you start narrowing down and looking a little bit further in. For me personally, when we actually designed this, it was to try and gauge whether there was a shift because a lot of the build back better, a lot of the building towards a better future was going on the assumption that people wanted things differently, or that people's perceptions of what they wanted had drastically changed. And so I wanted to gauge in a very neutral way whether that actually was the case. And so I think, Wendy picked up on the actual drastic and irreversible, but you've also got the triad 2, which looks at, why did things happen? And there you've got quite a lot of very interesting perceptions of because of something people did. And then in between, because of something people did, because of something people didn't do, you've got that little cluster there as well in the corner. And so if you think about your own communities, your own experiences, what does that mean something? And does it matter that some people saw that it was inevitable? And if it was inevitable, does that mean that that area wasn't reversible? But then if you've got more people who are actually coming from because something people did, from something people didn't do, then you've actually got more things that you can potentially act on in those areas. Does that make any sense? I've kind of talked for quite a long time without seeing anyone's reactions.
I guess one quick question, like, would you go into the tool every day wondering where the shifts came? Like, was this like a Christmas Day where you were anticipating reactions, and then did they shift over time? Was your first impression not your last impression?
No, I didn't actually gauge. It was never a look over time, which now in hindsight, and as we actually develop the new capture that we're developing, I think that is something which we will put in, because as you say, that's one of the big reasons that people use Sensemaker, is to be able to monitor impact, or to be able to monitor things over time. And when it comes to what people were actually putting in, I don't think it was a drastic shift over time. I think this is more, because we said the question was, the prompt was, imagine you're 10 years from now and a young child asks you what 2020 was like from your experience. And bearing in mind that we started in January 2021, this is retrospective. So the actual time capture, we wouldn't have gauged as much with this. Definitely something which we're going to be with the next step.
No, it's fascinating. And I'll encourage any of our people that have strolled into the discussion and reset our discussion halfway through. Just Catherine's just been talking to us about her global perspectives and Sensemakers in action. She's kicking off of her day, and we've gone through a number of very compelling and interesting slides and discussion. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat, or I'm sure Catherine will prompt you at some point in the discussion as well.
I'm wondering, just because we are 14, if it's worth just going into 3 groups, just so there's a bit of space for more intimate discussion.
The only problem is we are a recorded session, so it becomes a little bit of dead air for the people that might be listening to this later, which might be a much larger group.
Okay.
I'm wondering if is there a way to do it within the full pod?
Yeah, we can. I'm just nervous that potentially some people who might want to talk won't talk if it's a larger group. That's fine.
Yeah, and we do encourage people to use the chat as well. So if you have some insights that you do want to share, then please put them in the chat as well.
So I think these two, and we had a discussion with people over in Australia Monday or Tuesday, I can't remember. And these two were the ones that I know Viv was particularly surprised by. And I think the first one in this future people should was the biggest one, which has caused a little bit of questions, reaction, sort of, what does this mean within our actual local lead group? Because to have so few people who have put maintain the current state in the actual top of those triads is quite significant. And you can look at it, which is one of our questions, is does maintain the current state mean, was that phrased correctly, in the sense that, you know, the current state right now, I personally do not want to remain in lockdown for the rest of my life. But, or does that mean, you know, the current state of what we were pre-COVID, that way of working, that way of living? There's a very definite shift in the actual pattern on the triad of where people have placed their stories, that we need to either imagine new possibilities or imagine new possibilities and build new systems.
Well, it's certainly consistent with some of our corroborating research. So if it makes you feel any better, it's certainly, no matter who you are and what political stripe or economic stripe, what's come back for us is just, you know, COVID has been an important reappraisal of how we've done things for the last generation, if not more. And so, you know, whether it's the phrasing of the question or not, I think you're probably getting a good sentiment in terms of just the need for change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We have a question coming in from Luke online here. Thank you, Luke. He has the question, did you ask the same question more than one way? And he puts in parentheses a survey technique.
Well, in terms of this, because some of the dyads kind of some of the dyads or triads actually cross over in terms of what they're looking at. And Cindy, if you just go back to the dyads, please. If you look at the shift of the outcome of the experience I shared being drastic and irreversible, you can kind of look at that and think, okay, that does kind of coincide with that concept of no, the current state isn't happening, you know, it's drastic, it's irreversible, something else needs to happen. Thanks, Sean. And then you've also got that confirmation of, you know, more of a shift to the right side, and the experience I shared was, for a lot of people are talking about it being more extraordinary. So you're definitely veering more on a side of different extremes.
I'm not sure if that answers the question. The way I understood it was he was asking if we asked questions in more than one way to capture the stories. Is that, I think, what was meant? And basically, if you go on the website, which is we're still collecting stories on this, so you know, you can feel free to participate in this. But the question is looking back, and I don't know the wording exactly, Cate, you would know, but looking back, kind of
10 years. You're 10 years from now, and a young child asks you what 2020 was like for you.
Yeah.
You just ask people to think of a specific experience and share anything. Which is, yeah.
So it's sharing what's top of mind for people. Right? It's capturing what would be most significant for them.
Yes, you are answering. Would we have asked different questions in different ways? For the 2020 experience, no. I think the way that we phrased it was gauging quite a lot from people in terms of what we actually set out to test, or not test, but sort of to allow to emerge in terms of values, beliefs, attitudes, where responsibility came from. And that's kind of why we're now actually reshifting a little bit. Partly because we're now April 2021, and actually what's on people's minds isn't necessarily 2020, but also because we want to roll this out into a much wider program. But for the 2020, what you can do with, we did a pilot at the very start, and then this has continued to be an ongoing sort of safe to fail experiment. But what you can do when you launch these projects is you can look at, are the patterns emerging, and are people actually understanding the dyads or the triads properly? And if you can just go to the futures question, please, Cindy.
The which page? Sorry.
To the next page, the futures one.
Oh, yeah.
And so again, as you said, would we have phrased it differently, or would we have done anything differently? I think this dyad, I would have been more specific with maintaining the current state. And we also went through some of these results with Dave Snowden. His initial reaction looking at this triad of government, communities, individuals. My personal reaction was that makes sense, because to me it makes sense that it should come from everyone. But the actual way that Sensemaker works is there should be sufficient amount of abstraction in the areas for there to be more widespread stories, and for the pattern to be more widespread. So actually that cluster there potentially means that there's something wrong with the design of the triad.
Rob asks a pretty interesting question here, because as kind of curious researchers, we always look at, oh, what could be the question, the favorite new question we can ask in the future. And did anything emerge out of this exercise that made you prompt what is a future area of exploration?
What are the new possibilities, and how do we get people there?
Interesting.
Yeah.
As maybe a follow-up too, just what I personally believe that, you know, the pandemic is a kind of a generational defining experience for people. Having said that, we're now 14 months, at least in my part of the world, Canada, into the pandemic, and there's a certain level of fatigue when you bring up pandemic or COVID or what have you. I'm not too sure when you look at future questions in terms of asking this, you know, I don't know if you just generically say 2020 and just avoid any of the phraseology around the pandemic. Any thoughts around the fatigue that we're experiencing through this interruption of life?
Cindy, I think you can for that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Sean. So the way this was set up initially, Cate was recruiting people from various countries from around the world. And so, you know, I signed up to be the lead for Canada as an example. And when we were reaching out to large networks, and people were saying, well, we're already doing surveys. So there was so much survey fatigue that we had to struggle through. And we're trying to tell people that it's not the same. It's very, very different, and that your perspective is really going to matter, and your story is going to matter. All of us as leads kept bringing this back to Cate, poor Cate, and saying that this is a real struggle. So I think, and back to your last question, where we've transitioned this is, sorry, I'm just hearing that background noise. So, where we've transitioned this is say, maybe focusing on 2020, maybe we should shift that. Maybe it should be during the pandemic. And then now we're actually at a point where we've recognized that in conjunction with the Cynefin Centre, if we launch a platform that will be useful for people to collect data on whatever it is that matters to them at the moment, we will see greater uptake in terms of people's participation. And Cate's managed to have some pretty phenomenal conversations with people who are very, very excited about this, who are ready to get 50,000 stories from various countries. So it's pretty exciting where we're headed, actually. Cate, feel free to jump in there.
I thought because I don't think people, unless anyone actually wants to share anything or talk about anything specific about the data, I thought I'd tell you about PHF Shares and Palm Health Foundation and the work that they've done. Because in terms of conversations for our own project, I've also been scoping out what other projects have been doing at this time using Sensemaker. And we actually had a long conversation with Andy yesterday, who we recorded. So we'll actually be posting this up at some point once I've edited a few bits. So PHF Shares, they launched a while ago, 6 years ago, in a project which started off as wanting to engage youth with stories from adults and elders. And they essentially set out using Sensemaker to collect stories, and they went at it from a similar sort of dispersed way, but they had financial incentive, which, you know, also helps. And so the youths were actually the ones who were going out, and these were guys, well, not guys, but people between 15 and 18. And they went out and managed over 3 months to gather 500 stories. And all of this platform design was designed around sort of what, I think it was very broad of an adult, what would you want to explain to someone so that they can do better, or something very broad like that. But after those 3 months, they brought people from different communities, and that's the Palm Mount Foundation. They worked over different communities within that region, and they had these 500 stories and brought the people who had already engaged with the results, with actually getting people to share their story, and the youth network who had been involved in that, and brought them with a group of adults. And they essentially had printed out stories, printed out some of these patterns in the dyads from what people had shared, and put them on, like, sort of as a gallery view, so that people could go around and see all of the stories and take meaning from it, and do it, just kind of engage with the results in that way. And it was facilitated, so you had different questions which went through that sense-making process, and it was a day's workshop, which actually got extended because there was so much conversation and interaction going on. But for him, you know, it's the actual one, getting communities and people to, for them, and that's what I love about Sensemaker, is as someone who, I'm not a huge fan of someone else coming in and analysing and curating someone's story, whereas Sensemaker takes away that researcher bias, and you actually have, one, in the actual Sensemaker design, people self-interpreting their stories, but then it's not you, yes, we can do part of the analysis and actually look at, you know, where are the patterns, where are the weak signals, but actually the power of the interpretation of these patterns and these stories comes from engaging people who have been part of that process, and people who are engaged with the communities who have shared those stories, to be able to interact and say, oh, does this challenge what I initially thought of my community? And one way of facilitating these types of triads is to just give someone a blank triad, draw out, where do you think this is? And then actually show them what actually, you know, what actually is on the triad and where the pattern is. So they went through this process and that day, and the first time I talked to him, I felt quite emotional with actually the way that he was talking about it, because he what had developed from that was a very powerful network within the youth groups who felt empowered to do different things, to build that network within themselves, and then to act on some of the themes that they detected were emerging from these stories and from the patterns. And so they actually developed a whole network unknown to them. But what that meant was that when COVID started and they thought, okay, what can we do in real time to actually monitor? And this is kind of where your question came in as well, Sean, is that when COVID started, they then actually had this network of people to reactivate and be really engaged in collecting stories as they went along throughout COVID. And from that, they've been able to generate funding and divert it where it's been needed to support communities throughout the pandemic. And there's all sorts of other things that have generated from it as well, which that it was actually talking to him, which was one of the key things which diverted how we're now shaping our project, because it really is about community empowerment. And the more you involve people and give them ownership of this and their story and their agency, the more, and you don't necessarily have a tangible outcome. You don't necessarily have a tangible, you know, it's not A to B, but it's complexity. It's just things emerge and different connections, different actions, different things emerge, which are much, much more powerful than we can even anticipate or expect. so that was kind of a sharing of PHF Shares, because they have been amazing. And in terms of the question that was asked, do we do anything with the stories? I'm still working that out. So PHF Shares, what they've done is actually, they've got someone who's really amazing with R programming. And if you go, it's just phfshares.com, and you can just see their website. And they have actually uploaded all of the stories in the same format of what they did originally, with the initial sense-making session, where they put the stories and they put the dials and the patterns and things on walls as like a gallery. And so they've created that on their websites and put the stories up there. So yes, that is what we'll be doing with 2020 as well. And we'll be doing a lot more with these stories. To be fair, we've been too focused on kind of transitioning to next stage to really value what we've already got from the 2020 experiences. So this has been a big reminder for that. But I think it's, well, how would everyone like to see these stories? There we go. I can ask this question to you all. How would you want to be able to interact with different perspectives of 2020 and some of these patterns? What would you want to do with it?
I think Wendy might have asked a related question to that, so it's not completely a non sequitur to the question you've asked back us out. She mentions, how do you make use of the words of the actual story? Sometimes the specific words and phrases have real impact. And the comment is probably true. You've probably got a ton of text that you'll be able to generate over months and years. Is there a power of words that you're considering in how this gets used?
Not yet. That's because from what I see with the stories is you can't look at them and from the blind eye kind of look at where the themes are or what the words are saying. But you can get groups to kind of detect where the key themes are. But with the actual words and going down to that really micro level, and that's not something we've considered now.
And Rob asked the question in answer to your question, like, how do you go from the clusters and then travel from story to story, LinkedIn themes? I guess I oftentimes look at some big break and go, I'd love to know more about that. Like, is there a habit that you get into where it's like, I either want to look at the outlier and what they're doing there. I'm looking at maybe your top right quadrant here where there's like 3 or 4 stories up there in government. And I'm like, I'd probably go, I don't know what those people are talking about, but I'd love to know the little random isotopes up there. So
yeah. So that's completely what you do within the analytics, or even when you're designing different sense-making sessions, is you can either through the actual, there are 2 different platforms that you can work through the actual data, and all of it can be filtered because within the question you've got male, female, you've got demographics, you've got region, you've got age, you've got all sorts of different filtering abilities to be able to actually look through the data and zoom in on the areas and the stories. But I think the real advice from all the Sensemaker practitioners I've talked to is don't bias yourself by going through the stories. Really only come to the stories as you're looking at the data and as you're trying to answer some of the questions that you have from what are these patterns saying. And yes, I think that your first steps is really to filter it by all of those different things and answer some of your own questions or suspicions when you're actually looking at the overall data.
You had mentioned a URL earlier. I just want to pop that into the chat. I think you had mentioned, or maybe it's there. There we go. Oh, wow. Like you already know. I'll pop that in the chat for you as well.
I think it's PHF Shares. I'll find the website and put them up as well, because they're sort of several steps ahead of us already. They've been up and running and have quite a big capacity, which is really amazing. But this is the PHF Shares website.
You folks have asked some pretty incredible questions that are very, very helpful for us too. So I just wanted to say thanks for that, because it really helps us, you know, for future events, but it also helps us as a group too, to sit down and consider some of the things you've mentioned. And so really appreciate that feedback. Yeah. And the questions.
I guess in the time that we have left in this session, you know, we've talked a little bit about the future, but pivot for us here. Like what are your, you know, they say when you ask if you meet celebrities at all, which I'm going to include you two in the session because you've kicked off our entire day, you know, they don't want to talk about what's in the past. They want to talk about what's in the future. What does 2021 bring for you with this tool and kind of your expanded perspectives on things?
It's quite big, to be fair, sure. I'm not quite sure how to break it down. So as we've kind of hinted, we're currently transitioning from 2020 to a much larger program where we ask in general and roll out what matters to you. And for us, what this is going to involve is a much larger program, which will go much deeper in terms of community empowerment, community engagement, and also reaching out to kind of bridge communities from sort of, you know, that typical image of top and bottom, and generate those conversations within communities and within society around the world. And so we're going to pilot over the next 6 months with some specific groups, just to see what works, what's needed. And then we'll roll out from there and hopefully change the world, which has always been my favorite phrase.
Wonderful. And Rob in the chat has done some math on your stories. I believe your stories are 83 feet tall, or he's put some numerology against your stuff in terms of physical terms. So sometimes stories are oftentimes demonstrably interesting when you put them in physical terms. Any parting thoughts or learnings for our people as we move to our next session shortly? And our next session is in Spanish, so I'm going to be brushing up on my I guess third language of 3, which I'm very poor on. But any thoughts as we look toward the next session, guys? And Catherine, Cindy, that could be you can either jump out of the gate first on that one.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about your day ahead.
I almost feel like you guys were our, you know, there's like the drum beat in terms of just getting everybody started for it, because you jumped in so early at the 7 a.m. event, and I'm like, all right, we've got like we've got the pre-tease to the entire day. So I really want to thank you, and I think as a real compliment, if I look about the true spirit of sense making, what you've created and done here is really germane of that whole notion. Like, there are going to be some fun things we do later. Heck, we've even got a cocktail hour later, but this one seems to be really spot on in terms of trying to make sense of the world. So I really want to thank you for that.
I have to say, I only came into this entire sense making and complexity world a year ago, but it has been a whirlwind of positive things. So yeah. I'll just sort of close off our session and take my leave. But just thank you very much to everyone for hosting and for this exciting day. And if anyone has any questions, or if there's anything, just feel free to just send us an email, and more than happy to hear from anyone. And if you are interested in Sensemaker, I can tell you it is pretty fun to be working with.
So for the people at home, that is sharingperspectives@gmail.com. I think it's straight to you, right? Or is there a better way?
I'll put it in the chat. sharingglobalperspectives@gmail.com.
1G.
Yeah, 1G, just because I thought it was funny, but actually it's confused.
Wonderful. All right, we are at 7:55. We're going to kind of reset ourselves in terms of, I guess we'll do an official introduction to the day. This was kind of the start of something, and then we've got the official start, I guess, now. But we have a new session that I'm excited about. But before we do, I really want to thank Catherine and Cindy for bringing this to us. And my hope is you may drop into a couple sessions later on today if they intrigue. I'm going to try to pop up. This is always challenging, but it looks like it's going to work here. And let's, and it's always on top of something when you try to actually use presentation theme. So present. There we go. Let's see if it goes. There we go. And so we almost viewed some of these sessions as relay baton passes to each other. We're closing this session out on sense making. We've got a really intriguing session from Agustin on AI. He's got a crack panel of people, and it is the first thing that we're doing from a Spanish speaking standpoint in the guild. So I'm going to brush up on my Spanish over the next little bit. We're going to close every one of our sessions out with a couple of different calls to action. If you like what you've heard and like what we're doing today, certainly join the guild. It's pretty simple. Just we'll put the link in the chat stream, but it is we've bit.ly'd it up. It's GSGS member forum for short. If you have any feedback about this session or anything on the day, just go to Day of the Swan at greyswanguild.org. And we've joined Clubhouse. We're on about 6 or 7 different social media, but we're on Clubhouse starting at 1 p.m. ET or 5 p.m. UTC. We have a raft of different sessions in Clubhouse. So if you're around on Clubhouse or want to join, I'm sure some of our members can actually extend an invite to you. You do need an iPhone device or an iOS device to get in there. And as well, if you want to know anything about Grey Swan Guild, you can come to greyswanguild.org. Finally, a couple of things that are happening throughout the day. We have a virtual journal. So we're creating a time capsule of what we're doing today and across the month. So Sylvia, who's got a session a little bit later on today at 1, has created something. You can go there at bit.ly, virtual journal, Grey Swan. And as well, what day wouldn't be complete? And I know it's tough for me at 8 a.m. in the morning in Canada to think about cocktails, but at some point in time later on tonight, at 8 p.m. tonight, we're having one of the mixologists and country managers for Levenswater, which is a really interesting, authentic gin company, and they're going to create some stuff. And we're going back to the Roaring 20s. So this is the 2020s, not the 1920s, but there is the Charleston Fizz has become our official Swan cocktail. So we'll be talking about it then. And so we're going to reset our room here. A whole bunch of people are kind of probably going to move about, but I do want to thank our sense making session that really kicked off the day to a good start. And I am going to stop share here for a moment. I am going to